Okay, today we're going to continue with our topic of statistics and we're going to move into dot plots and outliers. Again, today there is a handout which has been posted on Schoolbox. I suggest you maybe pause the video and print out the handout, and that way you know what notes need to be added to your workbook that you need to write and which notes you've already got in the handouts. So a quick recap on what we did in our last lesson. This is going to be quite important for today because we're going to be using these terms again. So we looked at summarizing numerical data by finding the range, the mean, the median, and the mode. So quick recap, the range is the difference between the lowest and the highest value. So we just need to identify what's our lowest value, what's our highest value, and then we can subtract and we end up with our range. Our median is the middle value. So if you remember, what was important with our median was it had to be in order from smallest to largest. And then once we had our data in order from smallest to largest, we could then identify what was the middle value. Now, if it's an even number of data, we will have two middle values. We then need to follow what we have shown up here in the cloud. Okay, the process of adding them together and dividing by 2. Now, the mean is the average. We add up all of our data and divide by however many data we have. We're not using the mean today, but it's something that you need to be very aware of. And our mode is the most frequent or the most common. So again, we look at our data and we see which one of those is the most common, which one occurs the most times. It could be more than one mode. It could just be one mode. So we'll be using that today as well. So you don't need to copy this because you should have this already in your notes, but something that you're going to need to refer to today. So data can be shown graphically using dot plots, where each value is represented as a filled circle. Okay, so we've had data not necessarily shown to us in a picture, but it is a good way to show some of our data, and it's used commonly in statistics. So a couple of the important points with regards to a dot plot. Well, we can see that we've got a title. So if we were going to create a dot plot, we should be putting a title on our dot plot. In this case, it's talking about family size. The other thing that's important is that we label our axes. So this axis up here is normally called our y-axis, and this here is called our x-axis. We're going to talk about that more in our topics later on next term. Now, with regards to labeling our axes, down the bottom here, it's nice and clear, number of children in a family. So that makes it quite easily what we're talking about. We're talking about family size, number of children in a family. And we've got everything nicely labeled for us here. Now on our y-axis it says number of students. So it looks like it's a survey of students to determine how many children they had in their family. Don't be surprised that it is common on dot plots for people not to include a label on the y-axis, but if we're going to be creating them, it's something that we should be doing. But you may see stuff in MathSpace where they're not labeled, but you can still work out what's happening. Another thing that's important is we have equally spaced columns of dots. So you can see it's nicely evenly spaced. If we're going to be creating dot plots, that's what we should be doing, having everything nicely scaled and evenly spaced. What I've done here is I thought I might extract all the data from the dot plot just to show you what it really means. So in this case here, we've got one child in a family. And how many students have one child in a family? Well, there are 3 students, and that's why it occurs here 3 times. So this represents each student. So we've got one student has one child, another student has one child, another student has one child. So 3 students having one child in the family. And then we go to the next one, which is 2, and we've got how many students have 2 in the family, and there's 8, I think it is here. So again, it's the same idea. We're just extracting the data, and I just thought I'd show you. You don't need to extract data for each dot plot, but I just thought I'd show you what it actually would look like. Another way of displaying the data in a dot plot would be to have a table. Okay, we can see we've got number of children in the family, which is our bottom axis. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as we have here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we've got number of students. So again, we'll look at one child in a family. How many students are there? 3. 2 children in a family. How many students have 2 children in a family? 8, and so on. Now you'll be creating some of these tables in our MathSpace task today. The table, the dot plot, and the data up here are all representing exactly the same information, They're just doing it in different ways. So this is by the way, we'll just go back here. It is probably important for you to copy the dot plot and label this if you haven't got access to a printer and you haven't had an opportunity to print out the handout, and just explain what a dot plot is. Okay, so just take down some notes. I'll leave it up to you as to how much you want to copy down, but it's something that you just need to keep in mind. So now we're going to move on to our next part here, which is talking about an outlier. Okay, so an outlier is a value that is noticeably distant from the main cluster of points. So if we have a look at this particular dot plot, we've got a cluster. A cluster just means a group of dots or circles in this section here. But then we have this one dot or circle out here on its own. And that is what we would call an outlier. Now, an outlier doesn't necessarily need to be on the right side at the end. It could also be somewhere up the front end. But in any case, an outlier is distant. It's away from the main cluster. And that's really what an outlier is. It's pretty easy for us, especially on a dot plot. It really is very noticeable. So here's our dot plot from before, but this time we're going to do it as a bit of an example. So the dot plot below represents the results of a survey that asked some students how many children they have in their family. Okay, so this now gives us a bit more of an understanding as to what this dot plot actually represents. So let's have a look at some of these questions now. So question A says, use the graph to state how many students have 4 children in their family. So pretty easy. What would we be doing? Well, we'd have a look at 4, and we can see there how many dots or circles do we have? Well, we have 2. So in that case, we know that the answer to this, how many students have 4 children in their family? The answer to this would be 2. Question B, how many students participated in the survey? So how do we go about working out how many students took part in this survey? Well, we actually need to count all the dots. So if we actually count all of these dots, we're going to find, or circles, we're going to find that there are 28 students. Okay, so 28 students participated in this survey. The next question, C, what is the range of the values? So this is where we need to remember what the range means. Okay, range means our maximum minus our minimum. So here we go, I've actually identified it. We can see that our minimum value in this case is 1. So I'm just going to write min equals 1. And we've got max, which is our maximum value, equals 5. So I've taken that straight off the dot plot. Okay, our minimum max. And we know that our range in that case is going to equal our maximum minus our minimum. So in this case, our range is going to equal 4. Okay, pretty easy. Again, we're using the dot plot to answer all the questions. D, question D. What is the median number of children in a family? So based on our survey here, we need to work out what is the median. Now, this is where dot plots are quite useful for us because it's quite easy for us to see, and I'll show you how we can work that out. Now, I've got a lot of information here and I'll just explain to you how this works. So down below, I just extracted all the information just so you can understand what we're doing. If we had this information below and we had to find out our median, we would put it in order from smallest through to largest. And you can see that I've done that here. Now we already know from question B that there are 28 students, which means that we have 28 values down here. Okay. Now to work out the median is the middle number. Now what I've actually done, we're not going to extract this every time we want to work out our median. Okay, but we know that we would actually find our median would be somewhere in the middle here. Okay, so I'm just going to show you the way that we would do it. And this is quite important because students have got this incorrect in the past. So we would actually number our data entries. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So notice we start from the bottom and count our way up. So our median, because we've got 28 values, would fall in between 14 and 15. Okay, so our 14th and 15th data is the middle, our median, and it's in between those two. Now, if we had to work out our median, now in this case, I'm just going to show you using the rule. Okay, so our median, in this case, we would be, I'm just going to do it for you, we're going to add them up. But we actually know that it falls with 3, which is actually quite important. So our 14th value is 3, our 15th value is 3. If we add those two up and divide by 2, we're going to end up with 3. Now, the reason why I showed it to you, if your median happens to be 2 values and it's in the same column, we don't actually need to do the addition because it's always going to be the same value. Okay, in this case, it was between 3 and 3. Well, it's going to be 3. So our median is 3 children in a family. Question E, what is the most common? Now, we remember that most common means the mode. So if you see a question that says most common, I want you to think about mode. And it's very easy on a dot plot to work out what your mode is because it's going to be your tallest column. So if we look at 3, that is our tallest column. That is our mode. So the most common number of children in a family is actually 3. So very easy to do with a dot plot. Question F, how many students had 2 or less children in a family? Very important that we read these questions carefully because it says 2 or less. So 2 or less would include 1 and 2. And what we need to do is just count out the number of circles or dots that we have for these 2, and that will tell us how many students had 2 or less children in the family. And for this one here, it's going to be 11. Now again, if you haven't had access to a printer, you may want to copy some of this down. Again, it might take you a bit of time, but I just want you to try and make sure that you understand what we're doing. Okay, moving on. So the dot plot below represents the results of a survey that asked some students how many pets they have at home. Similar concept. Again, we can see we've got a nicely labeled dot plot. We're going to go through and actually attempt these questions. So use the graph to state how many children have 2 pets. Again, quite easy. We're just going to go to 2 and count how many we've got. And the answer to that's going to be 4. B, how many children participated in the survey? How are we going to work out how many children participated in the survey? Well, we're going to have to count all the dots. So if we go through and count all the dots, that's going to be 22. Question C, what is the range of the values? Again, we know that the range is identifying our minimum and our maximum. In this case, we've got 0 and 8. So we know that if we had 8 minus 0, our range is actually going to be 8. Because we work out the difference between 8 and 0. Question D, what is the median number of pets? Well, we already know that there are 22 children that took part in this. So our median is going to be between our 11th and 12th data entry. Okay. Now in this case, they both fall with 1 pet. So we can say that our median is 1 pet because they both dots are actually in the same spot. So that's going to be 1. E, what is the mode or the most common value? Again, quite easy for us to do on a dot plot. The tallest column is going to be our mode, and that's 1 pet. So the mode is 1 pet. That's occurred the most often. And question F, what is the outlier? Again, we're looking for that data that's out on its own, that's distant, and we can quite easily see that our outlier is this one here, and that's 8 pets. So that actually means that, yeah, there was 1 student or 1 child that was surveyed that had 8 pets. Is that common? No, it's not. Our most common was 1 pet, but we can see that most of our data is between either no pets or 3 pets. But having 8 pets, well, that's an outlier. That's not very, very common, and that's what we put here. Again, if you haven't printed the notes out, it's up to you whether you want to copy some of this stuff down, but we'll move on. So in this case here, it says that a baseball team manager records the number of runs scored by the team in each game for several weeks. So this is baseball runs, and we've got all of the scores put for us in a list. So what it's telling us is that in one of the games they scored 1, in another game they scored 3, in another game they scored 1, then they scored 7, and so on. So each entry is representing a game. So what are we going to do with this data? Well, it says create a dot plot of the runs scored below. So the first thing we need to do is identify our axes. So we're going to have, reading the information, it talks about, records the number of runs. So one of our axes is going to have the number of runs scored by the team for each game, and the other one's going to be number of games. Okay, so let's go and have a look and see how we would do this. Okay, so I've got runs scored is on the bottom axis. Okay, runs scored is on the bottom axis. What did I do to create that? I identified what was my minimum, and it looks like 0 is my minimum. And what is my maximum? 11 is my maximum. So I've created my axes starting from 0 going all the way through to 11. Okay, and that's the way that we would create a dot plot, working out our minimum and our maximum. And then we've labelled the y-axis, which is the one going vertically up, number of games. So let's have a look, and now we're going to go through this process of creating our dot plot. So having a look at our data up the top, how many games had 0 runs? Well, it looks like there was only the 1. So we can add that onto our dot plot. How many games had 1? So we've got 1, 2, 3. So we can put 3 dots for that one. How many had 2 runs scored? How many games had 2 runs scored? So we'll go again, same process, okay? We're just going to count how many we've got. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So in 6 games, 2 runs were scored. So we're going to put our 6 circles there. And we continue with 3. So I've got 1 game, 2, 3. So with 3 games, they scored 3 runs. So we put 3 dots. We're going to go to 4. So we've got 1, 2. So in 4 runs were scored in 2 games. So we put 2 dots. Now we can check again for the next one. 5. So we've got 1, 5. So we'll put 1 dot for the 5, or 1 circle. How many scored 6? Well, there's 1 up the end here. I think that's it. So we've got 1 dot for that. How many scored 7? 1 dot for that. Now when we go to the next one, so there's our 7, 1 dot for that. How many scored 8? Well, there were no one that scored 8, so we can't put anything there for that. How many scored 9? Again, we don't put any dot for that. 10, no dots for that. But when we look at 11, how many scored 11? Well, there was 1 game where 11 runs were scored. Okay, so this is our dot plot that we've created. Again, we notice if they're not appearing up here, we haven't added a circle for it down here. Okay, so that's question 1 completed. Question 2, how many games did the team play during the season? So again, if we were going to be doing this, what do? Well, we actually need to count the number of circles that we have. In this case, we could also count the number of data that we got up the top, but they should be the same. In fact, if you were creating a dot plot, once you've created it, you should count how many circles you've got, or dots, and how many data entries you've got as a double check. So to answer question 2, I've counted all my circles, and I've got 19. So that's pretty easy. We can just put 19 down here. Question 3. How many games did the team score 2 runs or fewer? Again, very important, we're reading the question. 2 runs or fewer. So 2 runs or fewer would be 2, 1, and 0, because that's 2 runs or fewer. And we just count how many circles we have for these particular runs scored, and the answer to that is 10. And then we've got our next one, question 4. What is the outlier? Again, we can see that we've got one value that's out on its own. And how many runs were scored in that particular game? Well, it was 11. It wasn't common. It was just a one-off occurrence where 11 is our answer, were scored. So this concludes our presentation for today. Again, if you haven't had an opportunity to print out the handout, maybe you want to copy these notes down. But please make sure that you read the questions carefully within MathSpace and answer them as best as you can. If you've got any questions, please email me. Thank you.